Hi, I'm Nick Vitchev, Research Director at Chartis, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Gabriel Hopkins, Chief Product Officer, Ripjar. Gabe, could you just first of all give a quick introduction to Ripjar for those that don't know you very well? And can you just talk us through some of the trends you're seeing in sanctions and PEP screening, first of all?
Absolutely. Great to see you, Nick. So Ripjar's a UK-based company. We specialize in a few things, but today we're going to be talking about the work that we do in customer screening and adverse media. So it's been a crazy 18 months for compliance officers with all of the activity that's been happening in the Ukraine and Russia, another geopolitical storm. So, I think one of the key things, maybe it's quite obvious, is that those guys have had to respond to just a huge influx of new sanctions that they've got to put in place and manage. And in a lot of ways, those sanctions have become more complex. So we see sectoral sanctions, secondary sanctions, really like never before. And so I think what we're seeing is that people want to make sure that their continuous monitoring is in place and that it's working well and that they're able to respond to that. But as well as that, we see a bit of a broader view of risk. So as well as the people you'd expect to be looking at sanctions activity, a lot of companies from the technology sector, the energy sector, are also interested in that. I think there's been an increased awareness about the risk of identifying counterparties, customers who carry risk amongst the execs at those companies. So we're seeing that spread globally, just a lot of interest on how people can put quality controls in place. On the PEP side, it's been an interesting couple of years as well. Again, a bit of an expansion in some of the PEP regimes. A lot of talk about a certain Nigel Farage here in the UK. So people thinking about what are PEPs and how we can sort of deal with those. So again, I think just an increasing awareness, and as well as that sort of broadening of risks, we're seeing people having interest in broader risks as well, which has really been interesting for us coming at this from the technology side where we are. So what do I mean by that? Well, yes, of course, you want to make sure that you're understanding and responding to sanctions risk and evolving PEPs, and make sure that you're keeping up with regulations globally, but also people are understanding that now they can use tools like adverse media to understand risk earlier in the process and maybe identify risks that weren't as important before, or certainly weren't as acted on before, like some of the environmental, societal and governance risks as well.
Thanks for that. On that note about adverse media, this is a term that we hear all the time. It's something that's really kind of exploded on the scene. Adverse media has actually been around for a very long time, but there's a renewed interest across the board from adverse media. What do you think explains that renewed appetite for adverse media, and what is a sort of next gen type solution look like?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, in some ways, a lot of what we're seeing with the expansion of adverse media ties back to what we were talking about before. So maybe an increased awareness of risk, people thinking, what can I do to make sure that my business isn't exposed to risk and can act as early as possible? And some of it comes from the regulation side. There's not actually been that much notable regulation over the last year, and we have seen a real increase in certain areas, which I'll talk about maybe in a second. But what are we talking about when we're talking about adverse media? There's a whole set of signals that come from all of the newspaper articles, the other news that's generated every day. And within those signals, there's some really vital points. So, of course, you want to know if your counterparties or your customers are on a watch list. Well, what you can do with media is you can say, I also want to know if there's allegations of wrongdoing against my customers. And so when you start to see reporting of incidents, the customers, the organizations that are using adverse media can very quickly respond to that and can therefore sort of mitigate some of those risks that they're facing. But it's a really difficult challenge. Historically, people used to use different watch list solutions. in order to get on top of this adverse media. And these would be hand-curated lists of people in the news with all those news sources and those things. And those are still valuable resources. What we're doing at Ripjar and what we've seen real excitement about is literally pulling in all of the news that's published every day. And so there's different sources of that news. There's some commercial lists, there's web scrape data as well, pulling all of that data in and understanding where the risks are and who they apply to. So what we do is we use machine learning, which, you know, AI, as it's often termed today, machine learning, natural language processing, to read through hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of news articles every day. And we need to do two things there. One, we need to see, is this news article something that matters? Is it about a risk that I care about? And, you know, in money laundering and terrorist financing, there's a typical set of risks there, the predicate crimes to money laundering itself, and terrorism. But also increasingly, as we talked about the broader risks, people want to know about other things that might tarnish their business reputation if they seem to do business. So we're reading through those hundreds of thousands, millions of articles and working out in each article who did what to who, and is it risky? Do we care about it? And then we're able to use the power of AI machine learning to condense that down to give people a view of that. And that's a really important sort of progression there, because historically the aperture was maybe a bit too wide. There was a bit too much information, and compliance professionals everywhere are dealing with false positives every day. How do I make sure I find the real risk without getting drowned in noise? And so what we've seen, I think one of the key advances over the last couple of years is by using machine learning intelligently and in the right ways, we're able to boil down that risk and really get to the important stuff. And to come back to your earlier question there, it's been really interesting over the last couple of years. Last year, we saw a lot of interest from organizations in France. There wasn't a regulatory change there, but it just seemed like a lot of the banks, maybe they'd be talking to the regulator and there's some unpublished discussions, but they were thinking, how can I use adverse media in my solutions? And actually over the last 6 or so months, we're starting to see that same level, same type of interest coming in a few different regions, including the US, which has historically been you know, maybe a little bit of a slower region where it comes to the use of adverse media and compliance. So we'll continue to monitor and assess those sort of geopolitical global changes in regulation. But it does seem that organizations these days are looking at how can I use technology to really give me a clearer view of risk, and if at all possible, obviously do that in an efficient and effective way.
Thank you. So on that point, one of the key sort of criticisms levied at technology, AI in particular, large language models, etc., is the explainability angle, and you know, being regulator ready and being able to be fully understood and explained, perhaps even by people who aren't necessarily too technical. So, what do you say are the challenges to that, and also how can institutions sort of respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating topic, and what we see when we go and talk to people in the industry is a couple of very different emotions. So people are incredibly excited about what's possible with AI, and at the same time they're kind of frightened of, you know, what happens if I use these tools and I get them wrong, or if by using the tools we do something which has consequences for my organization. So, you know, afraid to do something because it might go wrong, afraid not to do something because that might also have sort of bad permutations. What I can say, and I've worked in this industry for the wider financial crime industry for 20+ years, is there are lots of different types of what we now call artificial intelligence or machine learning. It's not a new discipline. It's something that's been used, particularly in financial crime, for decades now. When we look at financial crime compliance and those regulated activities that organizations do in order to make sure that they're keeping up with the regulations, with different bits of guidance, there's tended to be a reluctance to use some of the new technology because people want to make sure that they are detecting every single potential risk. In reality, what happens, particularly when you're looking at something which can be extremely noisy, like adverse media or some of those activities, is it's a bit of a false equation. So actually, when you sort of design a scientific activity and you have analysts look through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of potential articles to try and find risk, they miss the risks. And so what we find is to be very important with the organizations that we work with is that we're able to showcase this is how well statistically machine learning models do, and these are the advantages that they give. And so explainability is a key part of it. You need to be able to explain how the models work, particularly in the context of detection. So in the case of, I want to make sure I'm getting a match against a particular name, you need that to be really very explainable. And so there's a very, very limited set of some of the AI machine learning techniques. It makes sense there. But I think the real trick here is to find what are the right tools for the right tasks. And so we see a lot of excitement about generative AI. We think that generative AI is very, very useful for a number of discrete tasks. And we have some trials that we're doing with customers here, and they're sort of delighted with the results. One of the tasks there is summarization. What are these models good at? They're good for sort of getting the essence out of a set of material. They're really good for helping people write SAR submissions, for instance, as well, just creating textual content. We also think there's great advantage in using the models for things like helping analysts do disposition, because they're able to make really good, accurate decisions based on the right amount of information. What are the models bad at? Well, the newer models, not the sort of the legacy AI, if you would, the newer generative models will make stuff up. And it's worth thinking about these models as being designed to sound like they know what they're talking about, even when they don't. I think we can all see that. We've seen some of the horror stories that happen there. And so, what I'd say is when you're thinking about something like compliance or regulated activity where you really want to make sure that you have certainty of the outcome, what we found is important is to look at the different types of AI to look at the applications there and what's possible in terms of measuring those tools and putting in place something which is statistically robust. And we're seeing great results from that and getting that mix of different technologies.
Fantastic, thank you. And would the message be, don't be afraid of AI, try and understand it?
Yeah, I think exactly. So just be careful. Don't believe everything that you hear. I think there's a lot of people out there suggesting that these tools are magical, and that they're really not. Definitely understand what the limitations are of the different tools, what the risks are of those tools, and then find a way to implement them in a way that works well in your organization. And I think everyone's going to be in the compliance world is going to be on that journey together to some extent. I think we'll see small steps as people start to use them in increasing ways, just as we have done with some of the older tools. What we do see is that the regulators are actively saying, we understand that these tools are useful and that you should use them. But of course, that's a really sort of careful process to work with the regulator to find acceptable ways to use the technology. And it's really great to see that happening. And I think 2024 will be, really the story of that journey starting in earnest.
Yes, I agree. And I'm glad you touched on the collaboration piece and working together, because that's one of the themes we've got running through this whole report. So I think we're on time now. So I just want to say a really big thank you for joining me today, and also for your participation in our research. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions and reading the report. Thanks you so much. Thanks.
Lovely to see you.